Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to talk about something really fundamental today, identity. Specifically, where do our ideas about male sexuality and gender even come from? And what if I told you the answer is way, way older and a whole lot more diverse than you probably think?
Yeah, to really get at that question, we can't just look back a few hundred years. Nope, we're going all the way back. I'm talking about the very beginning, the cradle of humanity itself. We're going to see if we can find, the original social source code for how we think about gender and sexuality.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We're starting where our whole story as a species began, right there in the vast, ancient landscapes of East Africa.
So let this number sink in for a second. 300,000 years. That's roughly when our species, Homo sapiens, first showed up in East Africa's Great Rift Valley. And look, if you really want to understand our sexual psychology, you have to start here. This huge stretch of time, this is the evolutionary sandbox where our most basic behaviors were shaped.
And you gotta understand, this isn't some recent development. We're talking about an unbelievably deep history, one that's literally written in the dirt, in the fossil record of places like Ethiopia's Omo Kibish and Tanzania's famous Olduvai Gorge.
And when you look at a timeline like this, it really hits you, doesn't it? It just puts into perspective how new we are on the scene. For millions of years, all these different hominin species were figuring out how to adapt and survive right here. We, Homo sapiens, we're just the latest chapter in a really, really long book.
So, what does all this deep history actually tell us about the fundamental programming of male sexuality and gender? Like, what was the original blueprint for our behavior before everything else got layered on top? Well, if you look at it from an evolutionary psychology angle, for our early hunter-gatherer ancestors, sexuality was way more than just, making babies. It was a supercritical social tool. I mean, think about it for a second. You're in a small band. You're facing constant threats. Cooperation isn't just a nice little bonus. It's literally the thing that decides if you live or die.
Okay, so let's get into the why of this flexibility. Number one, of course, is reproductive success. You gotta pass on your genes. That's the baseline. But, and this is key, survival also required these incredibly strong social bonds. In the super harsh environments of Pleistocene Africa, things like same-sex interactions, kind of like what we see in our primate cousins, the bonobos, could have been a really powerful way to smooth over conflicts, build trust, and basically just hold the whole group together. In a nutshell, being flexible was being fit to survive.
All right, so that's the theory, the evolutionary blueprint. But how did it actually play out in real life, in human societies? Well, before colonialism came along, East Africa was this incredible tapestry of thousands of different communities, and each one had its own unique culture, taking that raw, adaptive potential and shaping it into very specific social roles and structures.
And what we find is that in a lot of these societies, anyone who didn't fit into a super rigid mailbox wasn't seen as a problem or a deviation. Actually, it was often the opposite. They held really respected, vital roles. Their difference wasn't a bug to be fixed. It was a feature, a resource the whole community could draw on.
And this isn't just some abstract theory, you guys. The historical record is full of examples of recognized public social roles. You had the Jodong Dala among the Luo in Kenya, who were spiritual leaders. You had the celebrated Odd Nega poets in Ethiopia. In so many places, men who embodied this kind of gender fluidity weren't on the margins. They were woven right into the very fabric of society.
Just let that sink in for a moment. This quote right here. We're talking about a worldview where it's your role, your spirit, your energy, not your biology, that defines your gender. That is a complete 180 from the rigid biological binaries that so many of us just assume are the default, the normal way of seeing things. But then, everything changed. This world of fluid identity, of these integrated and respected roles, it ran head-on into a massive, sudden disruption. And that disruption came in the 19th century, with the arrival of European colonial powers. And it's so important to get this. Colonialism wasn't just about politics or economics. It was a cultural takeover. It brought with it and imposed a completely different moral framework, one built on these super rigid binaries. All of a sudden, those fluid, functional, even sacred roles that had been around for generations, they were completely reframed. Now they were sinful, they were deviant, and this is the really crucial part. They were made criminal. And this whole cultural shift got a massive boost from religious conversion. I mean, just look at these numbers. The change is staggering. In just 1 century, the influence of Christianity, which brought its own very rigid Victorian-era ideas about sex and morality, just exploded. This wasn't a small change. It fundamentally rewired entire societies, embedding these new norms that condemned practices that have been perfectly normal, perfectly accepted for thousands of years.
And this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. The legacy of that colonial interruption, its echoes are still being felt. It continues to shape laws, politics, and real human lives all across the continent, right now, today.
And this is where we get to this really profound and honestly tragic irony. When many of these nations won their independence, the old colonial-era laws, things like the British Section 377 that criminalized gay sex, they were just left on the books. And then, over time, a strange thing happened. These laws, which were total foreign imports, started being defended by some political leaders as if they were traditional African values.
31. That number is staggering. As of today, that's how many African nations still make homosexuality a crime. And the really dangerous thing about this historical hangover is that these aren't just some dusty old laws that nobody pays attention to. Oh no, they are actively enforced. And they create a daily climate of fear, of discrimination, and of violence for millions of people.
So yeah, the consequences are incredibly severe. We're talking about everything from widespread social stigma to actual life-threatening barriers to getting healthcare. But that is not the end of the story, not by a long shot. Because in the face of all this, a really powerful wave of local activism is rising up all across the continent. These are people challenging those old colonial laws in court, using things like social media to build community and support, and they are fighting to reclaim their own histories to build a better, more inclusive future. So, after this whole journey, from our deepest shared origins right up to today, we're left with this one crucial question. What this all shows is that human diversity isn't some new, modern invention, it's our oldest story. It's baked into our DNA. So the real question for all of us is, what kind of future are we going to choose to build with that knowledge?